Watch this vidcast, or I'll gouge your eyes out.
Welcome back, Horror Hounds, to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show podcast.
I'm Mike Ghostman Pickle.
And I'm James Rivera. Well, the day that this podcast is dropping happens to coincide with the 40th anniversary of the release of Stanley Kubrick's classic horror film, The Shining. So today's podcast is going to be a celebration and a tribute to one of the greatest, most mysterious, talked about, and analyzed horror films in history. But before we get to The Shining, there's some issues we need to discuss.
Yeah, just like last week, we had some pretty serious things to discuss on the podcast. We thought so much going on in the world, we had to say something. And this time it's concentrated on the horror world. There's a new set of drama, and it's hit the horror world. It's based on the Daily Beast article about Cinestate. Cinestate owns Birth Movies, Death, and also Fangoria. And apparently Adam Donahue, he was a producer that worked with Cinestate and Fangoria. He sexually assaulted a 16-year-old girl that worked on the set of Ghost Story with him in 2017. That wasn't the end of it. Come to find out, he had a pattern of sexual harassment on these movie sets, and no one had done anything about it. So the horror world was turned upside down. Shockwave's podcast left Fangoria's podcast network, the Movie Crypt with Adam Green and Joe. They left Fangoria, and also Joe Bob Briggs left Fangoria. I guess he wrote for them. After Adam Donahue was arrested for assaulting the 16-year-old girl, a girl named Kristen Leah Hayes came forward with tape of Donahue harassing her on a movie set. He was taking her from one set to another, and they got there early. So he kept bugging her to show her show him her underwear. And I guess the tape allegedly made its rounds to all the producers and pretty much everyone on the film sets of Fangoria and Cinestate. And women were even warned of Donahue, and nothing was being done about him. Multiple people said that Dallas Saunier, he's the one that started. I guess he was Cinestate, and he's the one that resurrected Fangoria. And they really came down on him for allowing this type of behavior in his company. So what he says is all that he knew was that a friend that he worked with came on to another friend that he worked with, and that he made him apologize, and he did not realize that it was any more severe than that. So it's got everything in an uproar. We don't know the future of Shockwave. We know Shockwave's podcast is going to continue, but we don't know when or on what platform.
Also, as far as Shockwaves, Rob Galuzzo, one of the members, has left Shockwaves because he has also been hit with allegations, so he will no longer be part of the Shockwaves podcast.
Well, Rob Galuzzo from Shockwaves, originally he took a stand in solidarity with his fellow podcasters, and he said, I'm resigning from Fangoria as well. And apparently this pissed off associate editor Jordan Crucchiola, who went on Twitter and said that Rob Galuzzo also had a history of sexually harassing women, and he was then let go from Shockwaves, and then other women started coming forward. I guess he has a pattern of this too, so we don't know how much of his patterns of sexual harassment were ignored.
Yeah.
So a lot of people are really coming down on the horror community. I mean, it's inexcusable that these people let this go on. You know what I mean?
And it also happened extended to like other movie sets, like from VFW, which was also produced by Cinestate. Fred Williamson had sexual harassment allegations, sexual harassment allegations, and apparently a makeup artist said that he tried to force her to give him a blowjob, and she refused. And she tried complaining, but the producers, everybody said that we're not getting rid of him. He's too expensive. So they said there has to be another way to work it out. So eventually she just left. And from what I understand, she is no longer a makeup artist, and she kind of gave up on that because she was discouraged because of her treatment on set. So it seems to be a pattern of toxic behavior that gets excused over and over. And I think the big controversy is that Dallas Saulnier's defensives sound pretty week to me. They don't sound believable. It's just too much shit swept under the rug, too many things that he know about. Well, I only heard about this, or it's like, it seems like a who me, like kind of playing dumb, where I was like, that's inexcusable. It's not going to work out. It's really terrible that this is happening, because this is going to throw the horror community in uproar. Right as Fangoria, one of the most influential horror magazine in history, was being resurrected and doing such good work, it's very disappointing to find out the pattern of behavior and excuses that they allowed to go on.
Yeah, and I was hoping when I heard the story that it was just a story about a couple bad apples in the community, and then get rid of those bad apples and your problem solved. But it goes beyond that, because so many people allowed it to happen and so many people knew about it. And this girl that had the tape of this guy, Adam Donahue, harassing her and trying to get her to show him her panties, she told the assistant director on the movie they were working on at the time. She told the assistant director, and all he said was, he stood there shocked and said, "I wish I didn't know that." And nothing past that.
Which is not excusable. I mean, feels like the world is in complete uproar right now. Nothing seems right in the world right now, with the pandemic, with the protests going on for police brutality, and now it seems like it's infecting the horror community too. The only way I try to look at this positively is I'm hoping that 2020 is a year that people finally purge all of this negativity, so we can get to a better place as a society at large, and of course the horror community specifically. Because one of the great things about horror is, it's, in my view, it's supposed to be a genre that's all inclusive. It's supposed to make everybody feel welcome. Male, female, doesn't matter your color, sexuality, gender, whatever it is, everybody should feel welcome within the horror community. And it's really disappointing to hear of these patterns of abuse, and that is not what we represent, and that's not what we stand for. So
yes, I
think all the shockwaves, the podcasters, and of course the movie Crypt and Joe Bob Briggs have made the wise choice of distancing themselves from this mess. It's very unfortunate that Fangoria, it looks like it's pretty much done for because of that. But these patterns need to be addressed head on, and we need to do so immediately.
Well, because of all this, Birth Movies and Death and also Fangoria are looking for new ownership.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, time will tell what happens there, but the coals are still hot right now. You know, it's going to be hard to make a move either way right now, because everyone involved has to be held accountable. I'm sure a lot of these people that let this sexual harassment thing go, a lot of them that let it go, that I'm sure they didn't realize it was this bad. I'm sure they learned a lesson the hard way now.
But what disappoints people is that the people at the top knew this was going on, and they didn't do anything about it. They stood by and let it happen, and I think the reason is because of money. They swept it under the rug because they were a success, and those are not good ethics. Those are not good morals to live by, to know something is wrong and not address it just because you're making off good money with it. And what makes it worse for these producers was somebody like, if they would have addressed this from the very beginning, they probably would have gotten a lot of respect from people in the horror community, that they put their foot down and they wouldn't be in the hot water in the position that they put themselves in. And it's a certain sort of selfishness, this me, my money, that has led to their demise. And I think that's an important lesson for everybody to take away. It's not worth it to just sit by and let such toxic behavior go on unexcused. If you see something wrong, you need to stand up and speak up about it. And
when something like this happens, it seems to spread. It's like a fungus that spreads. And just like with Joe Bob, when all this shit came up, Darcy, the male girl on Joe Bob, she was online, and she was in the Joe Bob Facebook group, and some guy harassed her and insulted her looks so bad that it deeply upset her and brought up some old issues of self-image, like her self-image issues. It brought all that up, and she had to leave social media for a while. Mm-hmm. So it's just that, like, this toxic behavior breeds toxic behavior. But I don't think Darcy should let this one harasser, this one voice, silence her like that and hurt her so bad, because there was so many hundreds of other voices in support and against that person who did that. So let's just stop all this toxic behavior.
Everybody at the Movie Crypt, Shockwaves, Joe Bob are all making the right choice of disavowing themselves from the situation and removing themselves and no longer contributing to it. So sorry to start that podcast on such a serious note again, but the world seems to be in turmoil and it needs to be addressed, and right now it's in our own backyard. Yeah, because
it's dominating the narrative of our community right now, so we had to touch on it and say something about it.
No.
But I did want to talk, before we talk about The Shining real quick, I did want to talk about something that interested me while we're on the subject of Joe Bob. Did you watch Joe Bob last week when he hosted Mayhem, directed by Joe Lynch?
No.
I was so stoked for Joe Lynch. I put myself in his shoes and I thought, man, if Joe Bob analyzed my movie like this, I would be so stoked. I'd be crying. I'd be so honored. Mm-hmm. And then Joe Bob starts and he lays into Joe like you wouldn't believe. He talks shit about him for bragging that he put an Asian in the lead. You know, telling him to stop announcing it. You know, it's not a good thing if you have to announce it to everybody. He laid into him about character development, about the writing, and oh man. So Joe Lynch went on Twitter and he was like, fuck you, Joe Bob, and your fourth-rate movie show. And he was just so hurt. Joe Bob went on Twitter and he said, first of all, fuck you, Joe. Mm-hmm. He said, I like the movie. It's a great movie. He said, I discussed the problems I had with it. And people forget that Joe Bob used to be much more harsh in his criticism of movies. And I saw a little bit of the old Joe Bob come back. Mm-hmm. And he really gave it to him. But I thought about it, and I honestly would, I don't know about you, but I'd like to think I would like Joe Bob to analyze my movie like that and just roast it. If he felt that there was something wrong with it, roast it. I'd like to think I wouldn't be hurt like that. What do you think?
I think we'd all like to think that we wouldn't be hurt by that, but that doesn't mean that if the situation were to actually happen, that we wouldn't be.
Yeah.
So I can't really say.
Yeah, at the time of some of the comments, I was cringing, dude. I was like, it would initially would have hurt, but I would have thought a little bit more before I retaliated. Mm-hmm. So now, the day after that, Joe Lynch changed his stance, and he went on Instagram and he said it was a tremendous honor to be roasted by Joe Bob. So he completely changed his tune. So I can totally see that. He was really hurt in the moment, and he's seen that Joe Bob wasn't being malicious, that he was just skewering his movie.
Hey, people forget he's a movie critic. I understand that he's hosting a show and giving you information, but he is a critic as well. And a critic's job is to critique. Now that we got all that out of the way, we are going to get to the meat of our podcast, the 40th anniversary of The Shining. So
40 years old. It still hasn't got old yet.
40 years old today. We had to do this one because The Shining is one of the most beloved horror films of all time. It's one of the most referenced, one of the most iconic, one of the most influential, and one of the most parodied films in the history of the genre. Everything from the GRADY twins, all the iconic imagery, really stands out and really has carved its own place in popular culture.
And generation after generation finds love for this movie. Like, my kids are 16 and 18, and I showed it to them since they were little. They absolutely love the movie, and still to this day, when I put it on last night to watch it again before the podcast, both kids were like, wow, I still can't believe that was made 40 years ago. It literally looks like it was made yesterday.
And a lot of this is thanks to the man behind it all, Stanley Kubrick, the director of The Shining. So a little information about Stanley Kubrick. He was born July 26, 1928, and then he died March 7th, 1999, just a few days after completing his cut of Eyes Wide Shut for Warner Brothers. He was an American film director. He was a screenwriter, producer, and photographer. He's pretty much always cited as one of the most influential, one of the greatest filmmakers ever made. Some would even argue the greatest filmmaker who ever lived. His films are usually, most of them were adaptations of novels and different short stories, and his movies ranged all across the spectrum. Stanley Kubrick made science fiction films, he made gangster film noir films, he made war movies, he made period pieces, horror films like the one that we're discussing, comedies, broad satires. He started off as a photographer for Look magazine, which is a very influential magazine that's focused on photography. He was actually only an average student in school. He wasn't particularly accomplished academically, but he did show a keen interest in literature, photography, and history. And a lot of his teachers could tell from an early age, despite his lack of interest in academics, he was a very talented individual. He grew up actually very well off, which makes him a unique artist. A lot of our greatest artists come from a life of struggle, and it's what makes their art interesting. Stanley Kubrick is a unique case where his parents were both well off. I believe his father was a dentist, and they lived in a very wealthy part of the neighborhood. And when he decided that he wanted to pursue a career in filmmaking, his parents put up the money for it, for his first film, Fear and Desire. So they were always very supportive of him. And when his parents' money wasn't enough, he would hustle on the streets by playing chess to make money. So he was obviously a very savvy individual. Just one of the most interesting things about Kubrick is that most on Kubrick tend to focus more on his art than on his biography, because he lived a relatively normal life, never had any serious drug addiction, no major controversies, abuses, nothing like that. He lived a relatively clean and controversy-free life. It's his films that provoked controversy from the public.
Do you think that's why he was a little more comfortable to be rougher on his actors, because he had no abuse or violence or anything in his life?
Possibly. I mean, he was known to be very tough on set, and there's a lot of stories, a lot of legendary stories, especially about The Shining. We all know, you may or may not know the stories of Shelley Duvall, of how she was tortured on the set and she had a miserable time. But we also hear about Scatman Crothers, who also had a very difficult time on the set and actually broke down in tears during the filming of this movie, because Stanley Kubrick kept pushing him. And after 40 takes, he broke down and cried. He's like, "What do you want from me, Mr. Kubrick? I don't understand." A little spoiler alert. When Jack Nicholson actually attacks Scatman Crothers in The Shining, Kubrick was trying to do the take over 70 times. He wanted to do at least 70 different takes, and Jack Nicholson talked him out of doing 70 takes because Scatman Crothers was actually 69 years old at the time of making the film, and it was already taking a lot out of him. So Jack Nicholson was able to talk him out of doing so many takes and wearing him down, especially for his age. So Kubrick could be a little bit of a taskmaster, a little bit difficult to work with. His films usually took over a year to complete. If you were going to get into a Stanley Kubrick project, you had to be aware that it was going to be a big part of your life was going to be taken away for the next year. He didn't make films with the matter of weeks or months. He took his time. He perfected everything. He spent so much time in the editing process and filming, and I think that's why his films last so well. It's a certain level of perfection that filmmakers rarely ever go for.
And you could see the intensity of his directing style, especially in the performances of Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of people criticize this movie because they feel that they were overacting or they're a little too unhinged. But that was Kubrick's intent, mm-hmm. to do so many takes until he broke down their will until the scene would happen instead of them performing it, until it almost felt like it was happening to them. He almost had to traumatize them in order to get them to right to the edge of insanity, and it comes out in their performance.
Yeah. And just to let people know, Kubrick was actually not going for realism with the acting performances. Jack Nicholson, when he initially approached the role, he wanted to do it from a more realistic psychological viewpoint. So he started playing the character straight. But Kubrick stopped him and told him it was boring. And Jack Nicholson told him, but it's real. And Kubrick's response, according to Jack Nicholson, it may be real, but it's not interesting. You don't want to photograph the reality. You want to photograph the photograph of the reality. And I think that's one of the reasons that the performance pops off the screen. So Kubrick, at the time that he made The Shining, he was working for Warner Brothers. But before he worked for Warner Brothers, he had completed 2001: A Space Odyssey for MGM. Now, at the time, 2001: A Space Odyssey was a controversial movie just because it was so unlike anything that anybody had ever seen, but it was a groundbreaking film of its era. It redefined special effects, kind of invented the modern science fiction film, influenced filmmakers like George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, and even Martin Scorsese all cite it as amongst their favorite films. And it became such a massive commercial and critical success that Warner Brothers actually reached out to Kubrick and told him they wanted him to be a filmmaker, a Warner Brothers filmmaker. So they signed him, they gave him a contract. So for the rest of his life, Kubrick got to make films for Warner Brothers. And what makes his career really unique is that Stanley Kubrick made commercial films, obviously because it was Warner Brothers movies that were financially successful, but they were also considered art films. They're very renowned in the world of, for cinephiles, are almost universally love Stanley Kubrick's movies, and Warner Brothers sought to be a film studio that was all about the filmmaker. So he was the rare art filmmaker that had an endless budget and a big studio backing him and complete freedom. That is almost unheard of for a filmmaker like that. His first movie for Warner Brothers was A Clockwork Orange. It ended up being a massive hit for Warner Brothers, made them a lot of money, extremely controversial in its day. It got the X rating, which does no longer exist, which now would be translated to an NC-17 rating. So he started running off right off the bat with Clockwork Orange for Warner Brothers. However, his next film, Barry Lyndon, was a big flop. It's a groundbreaking movie artistically. It brought in a lot of new technology. But at the time, audiences weren't feeling it. Warner Brothers was hoping that it would be a big financial success because of the films that were successful at the time. But the film was overruled at the box office by Jaws, which is a great film in its own right, Steven Spielberg's 1975 classic. And I think by that time, audiences were looking for more big thrills. You know what I mean? A little bit more big thrills. And the cold, sardonic, intellectual takedown of the empty morals of 16th century culture in a film like Barry Lyndon probably was not what mainstream audiences were looking for at the time.
The story of Barry Lyndon was so heavy and so complex that he wanted to do something more stripped down, and particularly a supernatural film. So he started reading...
Really quick, he also wanted to do something that would be commercially successful and artistically viable. He wanted to make sure that his next film appealed to a wide audience, the way that Barry Lyndon did not.
Yeah. So he would read novel after novel, and his assistant said that he would sit in his office and he would read a few pages of a novel, and if it didn't catch his imagination, he'd literally throw it against the wall. Mm-hmm. So she was sitting outside of his office, kept hearing book after book hit the wall. And then finally, books stopped hitting the wall, and she went in to check on him, and it was The Shining that he was reading. So he read it all the way through, loved the story, and really seen it as something he could really sink his teeth into as a filmmaker. And apparently Stephen King had already had a script written for it that was sold to Warner Brothers, but Kubrick didn't even read it. He wanted a story that he read for the first time, and he wanted his initial reactions from that story. He wanted to amplify all the parts that gave him that reaction and affected him the most. So he hired novelist Diane Johnson who wrote the script with him, and she worked with him all day, every day, and watched movies with him at night, mostly Jack Nicholson movies, to see whether they wanted him to play more subdued or more crazy. Kubrick would do stuff like pose tons of questions about the characters and the situations, not asking her to give him answers. It was basically working it out inside of himself. Like he would ask, what are these characters' motivations? What is the purpose of this scene? He wanted everything to have a purpose. So they did outlines and lists, and they would analyze every scene, and then finally it ended up with a 36-page treatment with 61 scenes that ended with Grady freeing Jack out of the pantry. So this is what Kubrick said. Kubrick says, when you're not sure if the supernatural is real, it allows you to accept it. We view the horror based on emotion rather than logic. That's why Kubrick felt that Jack Torrance didn't need so much backstory and so much exposition like it had in the book. He said there would be pages and pages and pages about Jack's drinking and his family life, and flashbacks to him hurting a student. Kubrick just thought that there were way too many psychological clues that would take away the mystery of these characters, and that's why with every draft, he kept stripping it down and stripping it down.
And I think that works in the film's favor, and I'm pretty sure that's one of the things that Stephen King has issues with, because Stephen King is notorious for not liking this film, and it's for very personal reasons. And even though I disagree with Stephen King, I actually understand his criticisms as somebody who's read the novel. The finished product of the movie is quite different from the novel that Stephen King wrote. You could tell that Kubrick was only interested in the basic skeleton of the story, where he could fill in everything else himself. Kubrick said of the novel, I found it very compulsive reading, and I thought the plot, ideas, and structure were much more imaginative than anything I read in the genre. Notice when he talks about it, he talks about the plot, ideas, and structure. He doesn't really go into the themes. He doesn't talk about the literary values of it. He saw it more as a tool to lead him to somewhere artistically. And not only that, not only did he not read Stephen King's script, he wasn't even interested in collaborating with Stephen King. Yeah. Which I wonder if Stephen King took offense to, because I mean, you would think that most people would want the original author to work on the film with them. The reason he picked Diane Johnson as his partner was he actually almost adapted one of her novels in the 70s. The novel he almost adapted was called The Shadow Knows, and it's basically a thriller novel about a mysterious unknown person harassing a woman. Diane Johnson is a very accomplished writer in her own right. She was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for her novel Persian Nights in 1988, and her 1997 novel La Divorce was actually adapted into a 2003 comedy of manners directed by James Ivory, starring Kate Hudson, Naomi Watts, Stockard Channing, and Glenn Close. So Kubrick was a really big fan of her at the time. At the time that he reached out to her to collaborate on The Shining, she was actually working as a professor at UC Berkeley, studying and analyzing the Gothic novel. So this seemed right up her alley to come and help work on a Stephen King adaptation. And it proved to be a very fruitful collaboration. Kubrick described her as the ideal collaborator. And I think that he made the right choice by going with a different author, because Stephen King would have tried to make it to Stephen King and not so much Stanley Kubrick. And what makes The Shining special is Stanley Kubrick, the film anyway.
Kubrick didn't set out to, he didn't see Stephen King's story and he didn't set out to say, all right, I'm going to make this completely different. He went through the process. These things from the book were eliminated for the good of the movie. He cared only about the cinematic value of that movie and how it would affect audiences. So all the decisions he made were based on that, because the early treatment had a lot more content from the book. And Kubrick thought there was just too many details, too many clues that give away the mystery, and he wanted the viewer to be present in these moments with the characters. He didn't want to keep going back and showing their past. He wanted the audience to be present in the moment. So the first treatment had the old woman's backstory and the old woman in room 237. had her backstory about she was a victim of suicide, and Danny's imaginary friend Tony was a physical character in the first treatment, and then the second draft comes along, and it shows the scene with Danny and the old woman where it was just implied in the movie, and it also has the Grady twins laughing when the ball is rolled to Danny in the hallway right after room 237. So it showed a connection between the woman and the
Grady twins.
The Grady twins. So and I seen in my research that the old woman in the bathtub might actually be the Grady twins.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you notice, the old woman that's walking toward Jack has long hair, and they keep flashing to the one in the tub that has short hair. So that could possibly be the Grady twins. But on the third draft shows Jack's nightmare about killing Wendy and Danny, and it also has a flashback of Jack beating up a student. Now moving on to the fourth draft, we see the fourth draft was really interesting to me because we see Grady lets Jack out of the pantry.
Mm-hmm.
And then Jack attacks Wendy and Danny, injures Wendy by hitting her. He injures her, and then she hits him with the butt of the rifle. And then that's when Halloran arrives. Jack hits him in the head with a mallet, and then Wendy kills Jack and rushes to Halloran. And then when she gets to Halloran and she's trying to help him, Grady appears and tells Halloran, "Good evening, Chief." And then that scene ends, and then it shows the Rangers showing up at the hotel with all the windows busted out, and they enter the hotel and find the bodies of Danny, Wendy, Jack, and Halloran all dead, and Halloran has blown his brains out. And I thought that was pretty creepy and morbid ending.
Yes. They also had another ending where Halloran goes berserk.
Yeah, he turns evil with Grady, and then he fights Wendy with demonic powers.
See, that doesn't really sound like it would have worked for me. Another thing that they left out, originally there was also a backstory for the man in the bear suit and his lover, that really famous scene where Wendy walks up the stairs and then she sees them in the room. In the novel, there's actually extensive backstory between those two characters. It tells about their history, a little bit of their sexual history, the type of stuff that they were into and what they did. And within the context of Stephen King's novel, it kind of works because Stephen King was going for a more overt haunted house style of genre. With the movie, I think that it was a wise decision to get rid of all of these plot elements because it reduces it to its bare essentials. It reduces it to its purely cinematic qualities. Sure, people might be interested in the man in the bear suit and his lover and why they're there, but I think it's much more effective just to see it pop up out of nowhere with no explanation at all. Seems a little bit more bizarre. It always catches everybody who sees The Shining for the first time. They're always completely taken off guard by that scene and usually really shocked and disoriented by it. Putting too much backstory into that would delete the mystery and the level of fear that swirls around the movie. One of the biggest influences on this for Stanley Kubrick was actually H.P. Lovecraft, and Kubrick actually read several H.P. Lovecraft essays about what's scary and what gets under people's skin. And this is a quote that he used and he took to heart as kind of a maxim from when making this movie. "In all things that are mysterious, never explain." So Kubrick really took that to heart. So he made a film that's designed to stimulate the imagination more than anything else. It's very cinematic, but it almost seems to work in the way that a novel does. When you read a book, it's not like watching a movie. You start creating the details in your head. You start formulating what people look like, what happens. And I think the film, as cinematic as it is, it manages to do that. It plays upon the imagination. Since we don't know what most of any of it means and we don't always understand what's going on, our imagination seems to fill in the blanks, and we seem to fill it with nothing but dread and unease. It's the way that it plays upon people's heads that I think that makes it stand out, and one of the reasons that it works so well. The film is almost like a Rorschach test for your imagination when you watch it. Does it mean this? Does it mean that? and Kubrick just stripped it down to the bare essentials. And if you think about it, it's a pretty simple movie. I mean, the structure of the plot, there's really not much to it that you have to follow. And I think that makes it so much better because you get to hang all of your own, project your own fears onto everything that's going on. And I think it's all the possibilities of what can be going on that also manages to make it really scary.
That reminds me of a couple quotes from Kubrick when he was explaining why he stripped it down so much and why he stripped it down to the bare bones. Because he had this quote where Kubrick says, "When you know what's happening in a scene, the words will follow." So he cared more about the events, the characters, and the function of the scenes rather than the writing.
Mm-hmm.
He said, once you get the events, characters, and function, what you want that scene to represent, once you get that down, the writing comes easy. It kind of comes out. As long as you know the characters, the writing just comes out. And he also said, the key to shooting a film is not to shoot exactly what you had in mind, but to stay loose in case you have a better idea. So this thing was being restructured the entire time. The entire time they worked on the script and pre-production, it was always being restructured. And then they got it down to exactly like they wanted it. And then they got on set and it started changing again because he collaborates with the actors and lets them have their input, you know. And he has ideas on set that change everything.
If anybody has the chance to watch the behind-the-scenes documentary that Vivian Kubrick, Stanley Kubrick's daughter, made on The Shining, I highly recommend it. You get to see some of the people behind the scenes. And you were mentioning that the film, that the script was being rewritten all the time. Jack Nicholson became really frustrated with this on set, and he was always being fed new scripts. And in the documentary, you see him saying right in front of Kubrick, "Oh, they give me new scripts all the time, but I tossed them out," because he knew that as soon as he memorized the line, that they were going to change it anyway. And I think that's another fascinating thing about Stanley Kubrick is that a lot of his films are noted for their technical aspects and for the cinematography, like the high-level cinematography that seems so exacting. It's amazing that none of it was actually storyboarded. It seems like completely figured out. But he just went to the set from day to day, would look around, and then decide what types of shots that he wanted to make. He didn't like constricting himself to a certain idea. And I think that a lot of filmmakers could not do this. Just bear in mind, not everybody can do the Stanley Kubrick method, is just show up on the day and decide the shots there. But I think his experience as a photographer for Look magazine gave him that natural eye where he no longer needed to storyboard anything anymore in order to keep it fresh.
And a lot of actors can't do that either.
Mm-hmm.
They can't take lines that are just given to them there. They need a structure to go by. Mm-hmm. So that was another thing in his choice of actors. He made sure to choose actors that would shine and flourish under his style.
One of the interesting things is that there's as far as the casting goes, they looked at a few people. One of the people that they looked at was Robin Williams, he considered for casting, and Harrison Ford. And when Stephen King heard about this, he completely rejected it and thought that those were terrible choices. And I think ultimately he was probably right. I can't picture Harrison Ford in the role, and Robin Williams seems a little too manic. Yeah. Kubrick actually went to see Taxi Driver because he was considering Robert De Niro for the role. However, when he saw it, he felt that De Niro was too realistic. That's not what he was going for. He was not psychotic enough. He really considered it for a while, but he wanted to go for something that was a little bit more over the top, larger than life, and he felt that Robert De Niro, as great as an actor as he was, would not be able to bring to the role something that larger than life, over the top, a persona that he was going for. And Robert De Niro actually claims that the movie gave him nightmares for months. So there was a lot of casting considerations, but Jack Nicholson was always Stanley Kubrick's first choice, and he almost actually cast Jack Nicholson in a previous film, Napoleon, that he was working on that never came to fruition. So this was his chance to finally get to work with him.
That would have been interesting, to say the least. This role is so Jack Nicholson amped up to 11. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Because I've seen him do similar performances to this, but not quite that level of manic insanity. I wanted to talk a little bit about why I think The Shining is scary.
Okay.
Because I thought The Shining was scary and interesting from the first time I saw it. I think I saw it at 8 or 9 years old when I first saw it. And I've probably watched this film more than any other film in my lifetime, over and over. So when I was little, I appreciated it because it was a crazy dad running around a scary-looking hotel trying to kill his family. And it was a ghost story. So it was exciting to me. And then when I got older and I started understanding the themes of it a little more, it got even more frightening. And when I was able to put myself in those characters' shoes, it got even more frightening. And then as I became a filmmaker, I could watch it in a whole new way and analyze it. You could watch this movie over and over again for days and still find more things to analyze about it every time you watch it. So for me, the scares come out of the isolation, the anxiety, not only just insanity, the threat of insanity, because insanity looms throughout the entire movie. You think from the beginning that there's a tick in Jack, then he could snap at any moment, and you see little hints of it throughout. Supernatural elements too, they don't come until I think it was almost 2 hours into the movie. I think it's an hour 57 minutes in when Grady first opens that pantry door. So the supernatural elements are looming throughout, and you don't know if they're real or not.
I think that makes it effective, though. The fact that when you're watching it, for most of the time, there's a small chance that this all could be in the characters' heads, and you don't know if you're watching a film about isolation and madness, or if you're watching a film about ghosts. And I think the fact that the movie spends its majority of the time keeping the audience in the dark about this is what makes it so haunting and so effective and so unnerving. Stephen King's novel establishes right up front that this is a haunted hotel, and we know it right from the beginning. And while that works for the novel, it does take an air of mystery out of the story. It's one of the things that actually separates The Shining from most supernatural horror films. Almost every supernatural film I could think of tries to treat the hauntings as if they were actually happening or if they were real from the get-go. The way Kubrick leaves the audience in doubt leaves so much more to the imagination, and I think it actually jacks up the sense of suspense and anxiety, is the feeling of not being sure whether these people are going mad or there's actually ghosts in the hotel.
The plethora of suggestions and clues and hints throughout that something bad is going to happen long before it happens. So just constantly hint after hint, whether it's in the writing or the images. It's just something threatening is looming in the background, and you never know when it's going to rear its head. If you notice, the ghosts never actually engage the characters or harm them at all. It only attacks their sanity. It mocks them. It confounds them. And I don't know if anybody else out there is a believer like I am. I wouldn't say actually believe. I just analyze the supernatural experiences that I've had. When supernatural occurrences happen, they're not in your face. They're not a ghost scaring you. They get inside your head. They mock you. They confound you. They confuse you. They make you think it's coming from inside you instead of an outside force. That's the way the supernatural forces really work, I believe.
Another thing that makes the depiction of the supernatural really unique in The Shining is its depiction of supernatural beings is a big break from the horror genre. Up until that point, almost every ghost in movies or supernatural characters were always portrayed they were always shot in such a way so that you knew for a fact that you were looking at a ghost. One of the things they used was transparency, which is an old filmmaking trick to suggest jokes. And the other thing that they would use is light, luminescence, a sort of aura glowing off a person to make them feel like they're otherworldly or you're looking at a ghost. Kubrick does not do that. Kubrick was actually inspired by an essay written by Freud called The Uncanny. And the concept of the uncanny is something that looks like a person but actually isn't, is a lot more frightening than an orb or an aura or something like that. It makes the film more mysterious. So it's kind of groundbreaking to depict ghosts as normal, solid human beings walking around, not as these overtly supernatural creations that call attention to themselves. I think that's a big contribution to the genre and a big change for how you usually see ghosts portrayed on film.
And he also portrayed the violence differently than you normally see in a horror film, because it's always the threat of violence. And if you notice another thing, Jack never actually inflicts any violence on his family. You never see him inflicting any violence. There's always the threat of it. I believe it's every single scare. You see the reaction quite a bit longer before you see what is actually scaring the character. So it tells us something bad is happening and then shows us.
You mentioned that there's a threat of violence that looms through the whole movie. I think that starts from the very opening shots, the opening credits, where you see the camera kind of gliding over the Rocky Mountainsides in Colorado, and the camera swishes by the Torrance family as they are driving up to the Overlook Hotel. And while they're driving, the camera seems to be gliding in a way that seems knowing, as if it's hovering over the characters and aware. And just when you start to get the feeling that the camera is an implied presence, you hear this really strange, ungodly chattering on the soundtrack that sounds almost like a satanic ritual or an incantation. And just using those swooping, gliding visuals going in and out and swooping around the Torrance and on the mountainside, and the combination of that really strange music, you get the sense from the very beginning that the evil presence is awakened, and it sees in Jack an instrument to use to try to achieve what it wants to achieve. There's not many filmmakers that can imply the presence of evil just by really good camera work and the combination of music. So it gets that right off the bat.
That opening scene sets the tone for the whole movie, because you keep seeing that through the rest. There's a mixture of interesting, beautiful, and frightening images that are set to this pitch perfect score. Mm-hmm. that seems to come in and coincide with what you're seeing and what you're feeling so perfectly. You can't help but get caught up in it.
And really quick, just an interesting bit of trivia for that about that scene, that opening scene. The outtakes for that scene, where the camera is gliding over the Colorado mountainsides, were actually used in the original theatrical cut of Blade Runner, the Ridley Scott film, which a lot of people don't know. And this is what Ridley Scott had said. I had finished Blade Runner and it was a disaster. My investors were giving me a really hard time, saying, you can't end the film with picking up a piece of origami, looking at the girl, walking in the elevator, nod, and bingo, that's it. I said, it's called a film noir. And they said, what's a film noir? That was a big problem. And he said, we have to test this with an uplifting ending where they go off into the wilderness together. Well, I said, well, if they go off into a beautiful wilderness, why do they live in this dystopian environment? By that time, I had talked to Stanley a few times. I said, I know you shot the hell out of The Shining. Can I have some of the stuff? So at the end of the film, Blade Runner, when they're running off into the wilderness together, those are shots from the opening sequence of The Shining that Stanley Kubrick gave to Ridley Scott. And he gave it to him under the condition that he would not use any footage that was already in The Shining. And it wasn't hard, because apparently they had endless reams of footage and they tried it over and over. Mind you, the director's cut that's kind of been popularized over the years does not feature that footage.
Okay. And since you brought up some trivia, I had some other little pieces of trivia for it. As you mentioned before, it wasn't that popular at the box office, and it was panned by critics. Mm-hmm. It was actually beaten at the box office by both The Omen and Alien. It was shot almost entirely with an 18mm wide-angle lens, mm-hmm. which is cool for these wide, epic shots of landscape and these shots of the snowy hotel and everything. But then when you get in close-ups on characters, this 18mm lens kind of just slightly distorts their face, makes them look a little more unhinged than they actually are. Danny and Wendy are going through the hedge maze, mm-hmm. and you're close in on them, but you feel like you're taking in a lot of image on each side, so you see the walls of the hedge maze go by, and it's kind of disorienting, like the way the camera turns the corners and everything.
It distorts reality.
Yeah.
It kind of takes what you're seeing, like realistic, tangible, physical space, and distorts it in such a way that you feel like you're almost in a surreal environment. And really quick, something interesting about the box office. This actually opened up on the same day as the Star Wars sequel, The Empire Strikes Back. The Star Wars opened up on 126 screens. The Shining opened up on only 10. The Shining had a per-screen average gross of $62,234 per screen, compared to The Empire Strikes Back, which had $50,919 per screen. So per screen, The Shining actually was getting was making a little bit more than The Empire Strikes Back. It had a budget of $19 million, and it ended up making $46.2 million at the time. And another horror movie that it was outdone by was Friday the 13th, which actually came out within weeks of The Shining being released.
Yeah, not nearly as good a movie.
It has a classic status, almost like that of Shining.
Another cool fact is Danny Lloyd, who played Danny Torrance, the little boy. Kubrick was especially protective of him, so he made Danny Lloyd think that he was filming a drama. Mm-hmm. So even the scenes where Wendy has to pick him up and kind of run away from Jack, that was a dummy, because he didn't want to subject him to any of the horror of it. So he went through the filming of the whole movie thinking it was a drama, and then several years later he watched a heavily edited version, and then he didn't actually watch the entire unedited The Shining until he was 17.
Wow. Took him a while.
Yeah. And another one, Jack Nicholson was a volunteer fire marshal. So when it came to the time where he had to break the door apart with an axe, he did it far too easily. It kind of just shattered everywhere. So the prop master had to build a brand new, stronger door, and actually 60 doors were used in that scene.
When Jack Nicholson is swinging the axe, there's like that famous scene where he keeps hitting the door over and over until it breaks through, and the camera keeps shifting back and forth with Jack Nicholson hitting the axe. That's actually Kubrick taking hold and operating the camera at that point in the film. The editing. I don't think the editing gets as much love or as much credit as it deserves, because it's a huge reason why this movie is successful and why it works. The film's editor was Ray Lovejoy, who had been collaborating with Stanley Kubrick already for many films. He'd already worked with him many times. This is a film about being quarantined and about slowly going mad. And it kind of makes it perfect quarantine viewing if you're cooped up right now and you need a movie that's about being locked away from somewhere and going insane. This is the movie to watch. And one of the interesting things that the editing does, it gives the sense that there are no edits in the film. And I know that seems kind of strange, but if you really pay attention to the editing techniques that they are using, it sort of gives you the same feeling of what it's like to be locked up and cooped up and quarantined for so long that the days start to bleed into each other, and you no longer you have a problem differentiating how many days have passed, what day you did this, and what day was what. It all seems to blur together. One of the things that happens is that a lot of films use dissolves to try to transition to into the next scene. This movie uses unusually long dissolves that are really atypical for a movie. So as the scene is dissolving, it dissolves very slowly, and the other scene is coming in, and it holds on it for a while before it transitions into the next scene, giving the feeling that it's kind of unending. There's a lot of dissolves where the camera will be tracking forward, and it'll dissolve into another shot very slowly where the camera is also tracking forward, and it kind of gives it a sense of an unending tension. There's a lot of title cards that pop up. It'll say Monday, Thursday, indicating that days have passed by. You'll be in the middle of the scene, and the creepy score will be playing like just straight through, and in the middle of the score, it'll say Monday, and it'll be like it'll indicate that days have passed, but the score goes on as if it's scoring the same scene, and
like perpetual tension.
Yeah, perpetual tension. So the way that it completely bleeds onto each other, the way that the shots mix into each other, gives the feeling that a lot of filmmakers try to do when they do unbroken takes without the actual gimmick of an unbroken take. Now, I love movies like Rope, Alfred Hitchcock's Rope, which kind of is designed to look like it was shot in one take, and there's like little edits in there to kind of disguise the fact that it's not one take. Alejandro Iñárritu's Birdman does the same thing. And I like those films, and I like the way that a lot of filmmakers try to do this, but there is something that's vaguely gimmicky about it. Kubrick managed to do the same thing without even trying to do it. He managed to get the same effect of unending tension without actually going for the gimmick of one long continuous take. And I think that's kind of brilliant. And you start to go a little insane with the characters because the editing puts you in their situation where you can't tell how many days have passed, where everything starts to bleed together. So this is really unique, innovative editing in a way that I don't think it's enough attention for the film, because so much of the movie is balanced on fluid tracking shots and kind of never-ending roving camera. The editing is a big contributing factor to that.
Nothing takes you out of the film. It seems so seamless. And even the shocking moments, like the first time you see the elevator of blood, it's kind of shocking because you hadn't seen anything like that before that. And it was kind of comes out of nowhere. It comes in the middle of Danny like having visions. And you just see his face for a little bit, and all of a sudden, boom, the bloody elevator. And it doesn't take you out of it. It shocks you, but it doesn't take you out of the movie.
And I think the fact that it's really inexplicable is what helps to sell those scenes a little bit more. There's also an interesting detail that I noticed when I watched the movie from the beginning, kind of a little bit of foreshadowing. I don't know if you noticed, but when Jack Torrance is being interviewed by Ullman at the beginning about taking on a job at the Overlook, have you ever bothered to look at Jack Nicholson's tie?
Oh, it's the hedge maze, huh?
Yeah. So, and if anybody can't, if you're listening to the audio version, you won't be able to see, but I'm showing the camera right now that the tie is a very weird looking tie. They don't make ties like that. It is basically the hedge maze on his tie. And you know, I've never found that in any bit of trivia or anywhere, but I thought it would kind of blew my mind this time when I was watching it that it's already there.
There's so many subtle hints throughout. You mentioned before that some other actors were considered for Jack's part. Did you know that Kubrick wanted Slim Pickens from Dr. Strangelove to be Halloran?
I did, yeah.
That would have been kind of funny. But Slim Pickens said no after his experience on Dr. Strangelove. He said he did not want to work with Kubrick again.
Scatman Crothers, who ended up playing Halloran, was on One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with Jack Nicholson from 5 years earlier. And Kubrick was actually a big fan of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And since Scatman Crothers and Jack Nicholson were close friends, he asked Jack Nicholson to get him to try to talk Stanley Kubrick into giving him that role. And that's why he's actually in the movie. So that's their second pairing of those two on screen together.
Even on the next film that he did, he broke down crying on set because they only did like 2 or 3 takes. He couldn't believe it.
His next film was directed, I don't know what it was, but the next film he worked on was actually a Clint Eastwood film. And Clint Eastwood is the opposite. Clint Eastwood is known for doing everything in the first take, and if it doesn't, they'll get it in the second or the third take. So it did catch him off guard. Obviously, much different styles of filmmaking. You just got to do what works for you.
Yeah. And then finally, an interesting fact about the hedge maze, when it was all snowy, toward the climax, when the hedge maze was all snowy, that consisted of 900 tons of salt and crushed styrofoam to achieve that. And it was a lot of magic went into making this movie, dude.
And a lot of it, and what's interesting is that it was actually hot on set. In the hedge, when it was snowing, it was so hot that the crew members were stripping down to their to be shirtless just to get through the scene because they were so drenched in sweat and perspiration. The movie took over 200 days to film. Angelica Houston, who is the daughter of John Huston at the time, was dating Jack Nicholson and said that whenever he'd come home from working on The Shining, he would go straight to the bed and collapse onto the bed. There would be no conversation, no talking, no spending time together because they were so exhausted from working on the movie. Shelley Duvall had to walk backwards up the stairs over 100 times in the movie. She spends so much of the movie screaming her head off, and she's always looks haunted or fucked up, that she's crying all the time, that she said at some point she no longer had any more tears to cry because she had done it over 100 times. So she had to start splashing herself with water to try to achieve the same effect. And I think it really comes across in the performance. It really comes across in the performance how haunted she is. And Stephen King actually took a big issue with the portrayal of Wendy Torrance in The Shining, because in the novel she was a kind of a blonde cheerleader type. In the novel she's described as a very strong woman, very independent, but somebody who never had to face any hardship in her life. Wendy was mousy, put upon, and she looked like she'd been through a lot. And the reason that Stanley Kubrick chose to make her characterization so much different from the novel is he felt that it was kind of unbelievable that such a strong, independent woman would put up with Jack's bullshit for so long. He didn't find it believable that a strong, independent woman would weather all that and take it the way that a weaker person would have. And I think for the purposes of making the story more realistic, that was probably the wise choice to make the character a little bit mousier, a little bit weaker. And I think it also makes it a little bit more gratifying towards the end when she finally does find the inner strength and fortitude to overcome. You could see that she's struggling to get there. You could see that it's hell, but she manages to finally get through it all and kind of come out of the film in good shape. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and you could really see how emotionally vulnerable she was. And I love how Jack Nicholson defends her performance. Mm-hmm. He hates when people say that she was overacting, it was a bad performance. He said that was an excellent performance, that he's never seen such a challenging part for an actress before in his life. Yeah. And he said she did exactly what Stanley Kubrick asked of her. But I did hear that the writer Diane Johnson, mm-hmm. she said that she came on set and she didn't even know that a lot of the Wendy's dialogue scenes were cut because Kubrick was just not getting along with Shelley Duvall, and he just did not like the way she was saying the lines, so he would just cut entire scenes and entire lines just because he didn't like the way she was saying them.
And as far as the stories about Kubrick being a dick, if you watch the behind the scenes, it is kind of true. It seems like he was an asshole. But if you pay attention, it seems like it was sort of intentional by design. He didn't, not trying to be an asshole for the sake of being an asshole. But on behind the scenes, he's telling other people on the set, don't show her any sympathy. Don't sympathize with Shelley. Don't go over and comfort her. And I think it was because he wanted to keep her in a state of mind that got this type of performance out of her that she actually got. And I do feel bad for Shelley Duvall, because one of the things that she says that really hurt her about the movie is that her performance was trashed and she went through a lot. And she said whenever she would read reviews about the movie, anything that was positive about it was all about Stanley Kubrick, was all about what a genius Kubrick was and how brilliantly made it was. She said, felt like, damn, all that hard work I put in, and it's almost like I wasn't there to a lot of people. So I think that it took a toll on her, not just in the filmmaking process, but the way that people didn't respond the way that they should have responded to her performance, or overlooked what a fucking challenge it was for her to even make it through that movie.
There's so many iconic scenes and images in this movie that make it stick in the minds of every horror fan who watches it. Every person who watches this movie, these images stick in their minds and they become a part of pop culture. I made a list of every scene that I thought was iconic and kind of stayed with the horror community as a whole throughout the years. And you tell me if I missed any. First of all, the aerial shots and the score in the opening of the film. The elevator of blood. Things as simple as the carpeting design. How iconic is that? Danny's big wheel ride through the hallways of the Overlook. This one's not mentioned as much. The slow zoom of Jack as he watches Danny and Wendy playing outside. Mm-hmm. He's kind of got that white glow on his face of the snow, and he's just got this unhinged look on his face, and it slowly zooms towards him. So iconic, so memorable. The Grady twins, of course, saying, "Come play with us, Danny," and then the flashes of them murdered in the hallway. The old lady in room 237 in the green bathroom. Red rum. Danny using his finger when Tony talks. That was the actor's idea, by the way. That was Danny's idea. He came up with that during an audition. He just started doing that when he was doing Tony's voice, so that was his idea. The typewriter. When Wendy finds the pages that say all work and no play make Jack a dull boy. Permanently etched in horror history.
Can I tell you something really quick about that scene about the typewriter?
Yeah.
All right, so since the movie was going to be shown all over the world, for each language, a suitable idiom was used. In German, it was "Was die Heit kannst besorgen, das Verschiebel nicht auf morgen." And I'm sorry for butchering that language, but that translates to never put off till tomorrow what may be done today. Doesn't work as good in English. In Italian, it was "Il mattino ha l'ora in buca," the morning has gold in its mouth. I have no idea what the hell that means, but I'm pretty sure in Italian it has deeper meaning. In French, it was "Un tiens vat mix qui du tilars." One, here you go, is worth more than two, you'll have it, which is the equivalent of a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. And this is going to embarrass me because I am Mexican and I do not speak Spanish. No por mucho madrugar amanece más temprano. No matter how early you get up, you can't make the sunrise any sooner. So in each international version of the film, depending on what country you watch it in.
Arguably, the most iconic image in the scene is Jack breaking down the door with the axe and sticking his face through, saying, "Here's Johnny." The hedge maze, of course, and the shot from the top of Danny and Wendy playing in the maze, and then also the chase through the maze at the climax, which I feel is just as iconic as the rest. When Grady and Jack in the bathroom, when Grady tells him, "You've always been the caretaker," I've always thought that was one of the most effective scenes in the movie. It kind of subtly builds in the dialogue throughout, and then he finally just opens up. He's very candid, and he's very creepy. I always thought that was one of the most memorable ones. Grady unlocking the pantry to let Jack out. That's one of the creepiest scenes I've ever seen in a horror movie. Because up until then, you think that maybe all this is in his head. Maybe all this is in Danny's head. Maybe they both got the same kind of delusions or something. But then once you hear that door unlock, I'll never forget when I first heard that door. And you come to the realization, shit, those are ghosts and they want to kill these people. There's two final images of Jack. One of him frozen in the snow, and then of him at the party in the ballroom.
Before we go on, should we play our Grady interview?
Yeah, let's go ahead and play that one.
All right, so about 4 or 5 years ago, we were at a Days of the Dead convention, and Lisa and Louise Burns were actually there. You know them better as the Grady twins from The Shining, who say, "Come play with us, Danny, forever and ever and ever." We managed to get a brief interview with them for our horror variety series, horror show. It's only a quick 2-minute interview where we just get a little bit of information out of them. We are going to play it for the audience now. We hope you enjoy it. The Grady twins, everyone.
Horror show exclusive.
So you two are probably the most famous single scene in anything of horror. It's something that is imprinted into the minds of horror fans around the world. How does it feel to be a part of something so special and so iconic?
Being an icon. Oh my goodness, how do I feel being an icon? It's an honor because when you come to conventions you meet so many people and they all have a story of what the film meant for them, and when they saw it and it seems such a big part of their life, that feels like an honor.
What was it like working with Stanley Kubrick? How was he on set?
Oh, adorable. He really was, wasn't he? He was absolutely adorable. Very warm, not at all a star personality. It was a job.
He was a very regular person.
It was his love, but it was a job for him, yeah. But it was his love, and that passion came through, I think. I think it comes through the cellular, but it certainly came through when you were working with him.
Yeah.
You two were pretty young when you made this movie. At the time, were you allowed to watch what you had made?
No, it had a certificate 18.
No.
Yeah,
no. We didn't get to go to the premiere or anything. They phoned us up and said the premiere will be on, and but
Stanley Kubrick couldn't manage to wing that one.
I initially thought that a really big director like Stanley Kubrick, he would be able to have the law waived.
Or maybe a private viewing or something.
We didn't get to see it until we're over 18.
So
some years later.
Still applies, yeah. Come and play with us, Danny. forever and ever and ever.
All right, we hope you enjoyed that interview with the Grady twins from The Shining, Lisa and Louise Burns. That was a fun.
And here they are right here.
Yep.
On my shirt.
That was a fun little interview. So, we mentioned before that it's hard to know what the most iconic element of this film is. But if it's whether it's the "Here's Johnny" moment or if it's the blood pouring through the elevators, there's so much that in here that could be that you could argue is the most iconic moment. However, I would have to say it's the image of the Grady twins just standing there. There's something about the simplicity of that image and the immediacy of that image that really strikes the viewer's imagination. And I think it has to do with Stanley Kubrick's background in photography. He knew how to just put the one right simple image that would have the right intended psychological effect on the audience. It was actually Grady twins, the way that their pose was inspired by the photographed twins by the famous photographer Diane Arbus. Kubrick was actually a big fan of Diane Arbus, and although he never met her personally, he did study for her photography while he was working at Look magazine.
Some people even say that the miniseries, the Shining miniseries, is a better movie. It's a better adaptation in the way that it sticks closer to the book, but that does not mean it's a better movie. It's a not better movie in any way. So I put together some comparisons of both the miniseries and Kubrick's Shining, and also the book, and what the differences are between the book and Kubrick's version. So first of all, with the miniseries, you see right from the opening scene, less atmosphere. There's no nuance. There's no impressive cinematography there to grab you. The color grading is off. It's gray and washed out in comparison. Because I seen this video where it puts the images side by side, and it looks so gray and so washed out. No life in it. It looks like a TV movie. It was filmed, 20, 30 years later?
About 16, 17 years after the original film.
Yeah, and it didn't look nearly as modern or detailed or colorful. You see Danny's vision. There's no blood elevator because that wasn't in the book, but you see a CGI fire hose instead. Are you kidding me? All right, I get that was in the book, but come on, you see this little rolled up fire hose against the wall. It kind of closes up in on it, and then it unravels itself and comes toward the camera with huge CGI teeth. Nasty.
What makes that worse is that in another Stephen King adaptation, Carrie from 1976, which was even before The Shining, about 20 years before The Shining miniseries, they use a water hose to hose down people at the prom, and it looks so much more realistic and effective. It's kind of disappointing that a film 20 years later looks worse than a movie that is much older than it, that attempted the same type of thing.
Everything is less impressive about it. Even the hotel. They actually filmed it at the real Stanley Hotel, but it seems like cozy, like a nice place to be. It doesn't have these wide open spaces that really sell the isolation.
That hotel is at Estes Park, Colorado. It was inspired by that because Stephen King actually stood in that hotel, and it kind of gave him an uneasy feeling. Kubrick actually considered filming it there, but he didn't because it lacked sufficient snow and electricity to do what he had wanted to do. And let's be honest, the hotel that he created is so much more imaginative than the Estes Park Hotel.
Yeah, and I grew up, I was, I think I was in my 40s when I realized that The Shining was on a set, that it was the entire hotel was built on a set, and those, where you see like the snow blind type of light coming in from those huge windows. I had no idea that was studio lights. It sells the atmosphere so well, you just feel like you're inside that hotel. You never feel like you're on a set at all.
Really quick, as far as the hotel goes, the set that they design, one of the things that I find interesting about it, and I think is what makes The Shining work so well, is the subtle psychological things that Kubrick does to mess with your head and to give you a sense of disorientation. The movie, it takes place in a lot of wide open spaces, and I think that the horror in it, a lot of the horror that Kubrick emphasizes is the isolation and the mass and the sheer scale of the building itself. A lot of the exterior shots kind of focus on how isolated it is, how isolated the hotel is, and a lot of the interior shots are dedicated to making the people, the characters, look very, very small. And one of the things that Kubrick does, since he tries to emphasize space so much to disorient us, is he makes the type of architecture that doesn't make sense. For example, when Jack Torrance first meets Ullman and he's in that room trying to discuss what he has to do to take care of the building, the room is located in the middle of the building, smack dab in the middle. If you watch the camera, follow it to the middle, and there's a window in this room where you could see the outside. And psychologically, you may not realize it, but that throws your head off because there shouldn't be a window in the middle of a hotel where you can see outside. Not only that, it also comes down to the carpet patterns, the famous carpet patterns that everybody loves and talks about. The scene where the ball is rolling towards Danny, you'll notice it rolls on a perfect pathway, the way that the way that the design is, and it seems to go almost like in a line and line up right at Danny. When Danny stands up, if you pay close attention, the carpet patterns are switched in the opposite direction. It's these subtle things that you don't realize when you're watching the movie, but they all contribute to the psychological effect of complete disorientation, of being inside an environment that doesn't feel that's realistic, but something is off and you can't put your finger on it. So Kubrick found these little subtle tricks to make the hotel seem like it was alive and actively messing with the viewer's understanding of space.
The ballroom with the bar and everything, that was so much more impressive, so much creepier, so much more ambiguous than the miniseries. You see that scene in the miniseries, and it's kind of just it's trying to sell the horror without the ambiguity. It's trying to present it to you rather than worming it inside your head. And then it gets to the old lady in the bathroom. Now, this was one of the most impressive things about the miniseries, because the old lady in the bathroom did have great makeup. It was somewhat scary, but still not as scary as the original, as Kubrick's version. And also, people say that, especially Stephen King, he says that he has a problem with Kubrick's The Shining because the Jack character becomes too crazy too fast. It's even faster in the miniseries. It's a few minutes into it, he's acting completely unhinged, and there's already a threat of violence against his wife. And he actually goes through with that violence in this one. So just everything about it was less effective to me. And then you got when Jack locked in the freezer, much less exciting, much less scary. Another one, much less ambiguous. And then that fucking red rum, dude. Instead of, you remember that great scene in the movie where you see red rum? Wendy, she's hugging Danny, and she looks over in the mirror, and she sees the reflection of red rum in the mirror, and that's when she realizes it says murder. In the miniseries, you see red rum on the wall painted just like it was in Kubrick's version, but then it kind of CGI melts and then goes down in the bottom into murder. Cheesy as hell, takes you out of the movie, no good. The Halloran attack was less suspenseful, less shocking, and then the end is just pure anticlimactic. Even though it had a big explosion, which was the typical thing in every horror movie where there's a big giant haunted house, you better believe there's going to be some kind of big fire and explosion at the end. And I didn't like that aspect of the book, and I didn't like that aspect of the miniseries. It just completely anticlimactic. It didn't leave you with that feeling that Kubrick's version did. I just thought it failed the story.
Stephen King, when he talks about Kubrick's The Shining, one of the issues that he has with it is that he believes Kubrick doesn't understand the genre in the sense and the way that he films it. And I think that's what makes it such an effective horror movie, is he doesn't film things in the typical way. Yeah. For example, Stephen King believes that Kubrick missed a really good jump scare at the moment where Wendy is looking through Jack's typewriter, and she starts to see that all he's been typing over and over is all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. Now, a typical filmmaker would do something where he comes out of the background and it would scare the shit out of you and says hi. You kind of like it would kind of like, you know, give you a really good jump scare. In the movie, Kubrick lets you know right off the bat that Jack Nicholson is watching her as the camera pans very slowly to Jack Nicholson, an over-the-shoulder shot of Jack Nicholson watching Shelley Duvall as she's rummaging through his papers before he finally says hi, and kind of scares the shit out of her. And I think what works as far why Stephen King is completely wrong about that is the fact that there isn't a jump scare there makes the entire scene tense. Jump scares tend to relieve tension. They tend to like give you a certain relief as you're waiting, you get jumped, and then you feel a little bit relief because it's gone. Because there's no jump scare in that entire scene, the tension never lets up as the music, that strange spidery music that starts to get inside your head and audibly fuck with your mind, keeps going and going as he follows her all the way up the stairs backward. There's this really palpable sense of tension that would have completely been broken and lost by a jump scare in the movie. And I think a lot of horror fans who say don't like it because it doesn't possess a lot of the typical things that make horror movies, or even haunted house pictures. It doesn't have any gothic imagery, which is unusual for a film about a haunted place. There's no use of shadows or nighttime, or not much use of nighttime. I mean, some of the scenes do take place at night, but everything is so brightly lit and so cleanly lit that you could kind of see everything the way that it's lit. So instead of the usual shadowy jump scares, you get a kind of radiation. The feeling that I get off of it is that the hotel just radiates a certain type of presence. It gives you a certain type of vibe, where the movie starts to feel like it's an environment onto itself. All of Kubrick's films seem like you're kind of, what makes them so magical is that they are so worked out that you feel like you've entered in an environment while you're watching it, and it's something that you can't get out of. There's no gothic imagery, no shadows, none of the typical jump scares, and I think a lot of horror fans don't like that. It does not have a lot of the cliches of the genre. Kubrick stripped it down and reduced it to pure terror, the essence of just that uneasy, creeping feeling that just keeps building and building and building, and his refusal to let that tension ever go with a cheap jump scare is kind of what makes it such an effective movie. And that's what I think Stephen King doesn't get about it, is that he wanted it to be filmed like a typical horror movie, and if it was, nobody would be talking about it to this day.
Yeah.
Nobody would be caring anymore. It wouldn't have the same impact if it was filmed like every other horror movie is filmed. Like the miniseries is, which is jump scares. Yeah. Typical shit that we see all the time. Nothing special about it. It's been done before. It's been done a million times.
Well, a lot of horror filmmakers make films for horror fans.
Mm-hmm.
They take their influences from other horror films that they'd seen and try to give horror fans their version of what they've seen before. But Kubrick wanted to speak not to just horror fans, he wanted to speak to film fans in general and to human beings.
Yeah.
And give them a story that every human being could relate to, not necessarily just horror fans. And he wasn't interested in any of the tropes.
Mm-hmm. And if you notice, Kubrick actually was a fan of horror movies, and he loved The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby. I think a key to understanding this film is David Lynch's Eraserhead, which, like The Shining, is a movie that I don't know if I would. The Eraserhead is a horror movie, but a lot of people wouldn't classify it as such because it doesn't have any typical jump scares. It doesn't have the usual tropes, but it builds a sustained mood that leaves you tense and on edge. It makes you feel easy. Eraserhead actually has some of the same effects that The Shining has. It feels like you've entered an environment onto itself, where the movie kind of radiates the feeling, radiates a certain feeling that transfers over to the audience. And I think that Kubrick achieves just that. He wanted to trance the audience out into a certain type of mood to make you feel like you were inside there with the Torrances, that you were experiencing everything that they experienced. And it's hard to even put into words what Kubrick really achieves with the cinematography of this movie, because you just get the sense that this place is evil. And I can't even put my finger on why. It's the way that the camera moves, it's the way of the music, it's the lighting, it's everything. The movie has atmosphere to fucking spare.
So much attention to detail on every single aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this attention to detail added with the magic of collaboration and of changing things at the last minute to fit the movie, like constantly letting it evolve into what it became, and that includes the editing.
One of the other innovative things that we need to talk about is the use of the Steadicam. Now, the Steadicam was invented by Garrett Brown. Steadicam was first used in the Hal Ashby film Bound for Glory, and that movie actually received an Academy Award for Best Cinematography. It was used in Rocky, in the sequences where Rocky is running and training, and it was used also in Return of the Jedi, which Garrett Brown actually operated it on that film. He walked through a redwood forest with the Steadicam, shooting the film at 1 frame per second to achieve the illusion of high-speed motion during the speed bike chase. When he heard about The Shining and the way that Kubrick intended to use the Steadicam, he was really blown away and really excited and wanted to be involved, because he felt that when he talked to other filmmakers about using this sort of technology, that one of the things that they would get excited about is just like simple stunts like staircases and weird angles, and he didn't feel that anybody was actually using the Steadicam in the way that it was meant to be used, using it as a tool that kind of immerses the audience into the film a little bit more. And with Kubrick, he felt that that Kubrick really understood the use of the camera, so he ended up working on the film and operating the Steadicam on set. He had to develop a two-hand technique that allowed him to maintain the camera at one height while panning and tilting. The Steadicam made it possible to shoot in constricted rooms without flying out walls and backing the camera into doors, which had always been a big problem up until that point. He used an 18mm Cook lens that allowed the Steadicam to pass within an inch of walls and door frames. And he honestly felt that this was the best use that his invention ever had in a film. And I say I'd have to agree with him. There's never been a better use of Steadicam in the history of film than there has been in The Shining. The scenes where Danny is riding his little tricycle all the way around the hotel, absolutely mesmerizing. And it's all because the way that the camera moves, the fluidity of the camera almost feels unnatural. It almost seems supernatural, that it starts to feel like you're the evil presence. The camera is assuming the evil presence of the hotel as it follows Danny riding his tricycles. And another element that makes those scenes so surreal is the way that Kubrick connected the sets. When you see Danny going in circles around the hotel, in reality, he should be going in the same circles over and over again. You should be seeing the same things over and over. But every time as he rides the tricycle, he seems to like he's ending up in higher levels of the building, and it makes no sense. But Stanley Kubrick connected the sets in a certain way to kind of disorient the audience, to make them feel that they were entering different levels of the hotel without ever stepping onto a different level. It's these really, that and the sounds. I think this was totally unintentional, but the way that when the tricycle is on the hardwood floor, it has a sound that's kind of mesmerizing, and then it goes over the carpets, and it's very muffled, and you don't hear anything. Then it goes back down to the hardwood floor, and it whirs again. Then it's really silent on the carpet. It all helps to kind of trance you out into a certain state of mind that makes you feel that you are experiencing something very surreal happening. It is such masterful use of the technology, so inventive, so disorienting. and one of the highlights of the movie. It's a big contributing factor to what makes the film so effective.
Even some of the stationary shots where they could have easily, and anybody else would have put a tripod on there, because the camera doesn't move in these shots. Mm-hmm. It's not supposed to have a camera movement, so it could have easily been a tripod, but he still has the steady cam on those shots. So you see a very slight movement during the shot, just to give you a slight little bit of disorientation. Let's look at the major differences between the book and the movie.
Okay.
One major difference was the weapon. In the book, it was a rope mallet. It's like a croquet mallet. It was not an axe. And in the book, he breaks Wendy's back and leg with it and ends up smashing his own face. Mm-hmm. And in the book, there was no hedge maze, but there were some cheesy topiary animals who attack. Room 237 was room 217 in the book, and it was changed. Just the hotel asked them to change it because they didn't want their guests thinking that 217 was cursed. And then that led to people thinking that that was a hint that Stanley Kubrick helped film the fake moon landing, because the moon is 237,000 miles from Earth.
I have some stuff to say about the crazy theories that have evolved. We'll get to that later.
In the book, there was no elevator of blood. There was no here's Johnny. There was no all work and no play make Jack a dull boy. And as we mentioned before, Tony appears a lot more in the book, and he's a physical being, and he's actually Danny's future self, trying to warn him about the Overlook. And then, as you mentioned, Wendy is much stronger in the book. And then I don't agree at all with what Stephen King said. He said that Wendy's character is a misogynistic character put there to scream and be stupid. I thought that was an insult to her. It was an insult to what Kubrick meant her to be. Mm-hmm. He made her like that as a realism, because, like you said, a strong woman would not be with Jack. She would not put up with his bullshit. So
I can tell you, as somebody who was raised by strong women, by matriarchs, they've, like, the strong women I grew up around, like my mother and my grandmother, would have smacked the shit out of their husband if they ever treated them or acted that way. That shit would not fly. So no, that isn't realistic.
But I think her emotional vulnerability was one of the main parts that made you care about the characters, and also made it more frightening. Yeah. Because you put yourself in her shoes and her crazy emotional state, and realize that you might be kind of the same way if you were in that situation. In the book, the hotel is more alive. The movie is much more mysterious and ambiguous about what the hotel is all about.
Benefit.
Yeah, in the book, you feel like it's more of a traditional ghost story. But in the movie, you don't know what's terrorizing these people. You don't know if it's in their head, and you go through most of the movie without realizing exactly what's going on. And I think that serves the story pretty well, because the book goes for scares, where the movie goes to make you unsettled. In the book, Jack is more layered. As we mentioned before, he's got more backstory, more flashbacks, and he redeems himself at the end. I think it's this grim ending that Kubrick had gave it more depth, I think.
Some of the biggest differences, having read the novel, is a matter of tone. And it's also the simple fact that the way that Stephen King approaches characters in art is much different than the way that Stanley Kubrick approaches his art. Stephen King, as far as his stories go, though, his writing style, and I am a big Stephen King fan, there's a certain warmth to a lot of his characters. A lot of what makes his writing special is that it's about regular people that seem relatable, their emotions that we have, things that we go through, and he wants you to get attached to the characters and feel like a very central kind of emotional connection with these characters. Stephen King has a very romantic view of the world. Stanley Kubrick was a nihilist. He was more sardonic. His movies were a little bit more sarcastic, and he had a much harsher view of humanity, which explains the shift in tone, that he sees the world from a different vantage point than Stephen King does. And Stephen King said it best, is like the difference between the two is that I'm a warm person and Stanley Kubrick's kind of cold. The book ends with the hotel going up in flames and fire. The movie ends with the hotel freezing. So that's almost like the perfect metaphor for the difference in their styles. In the book, Jack Torrance is a very emotionally warm character, and he's very layered, and you feel so much for him. In the movie, Jack Nicholson looks like he's unhinged from the beginning. You could tell that he's just on the verge of just snapping, and the hotel is like the perfect place for him to go to push him just over the edge of the abyss that he's been standing out at for the longest time anyway. So it's a different tone, different focus. And the book is more about a man who is trying to fight his demons, a man who is trying to overcome and care about his family. And the movie is about a man trying to hide his demons. That's a much different focus, and it gives it a much different tone. In the book, Danny is a much more talkative boy. He's full of personality and spunk. In the movie, he seems quiet and withdrawn. Same thing with Wendy, more strong and independent. In the movie, she's a little bit weaker and mousier. So it's a lot of it is the characterizations, the tone, and a lot of it has to do with each artist's worldview.
And the supernatural elements in the book, these ghosts are meant to be ghosts in an old hotel, like we've seen many, 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 many times. Mm-hmm. But the ghosts, the supernatural element in Kubrick's version, they all seem like part of a small part of the whole. Mm-hmm. And you don't really know what they're all about, what their motivation is, but you feel like they're part of some evil consortium or something. Mm-hmm. And you can't quite put your finger on it. They don't feel like your typical ghosts in an old hotel, and I think that's what added more layers to the story in the movie.
And I think that works for it because, for example, The Changeling, which is another great haunted horror film, much different from The Shining. Like most haunted house films, in The Changeling, you get the sense that the house is haunted by spirits. In The Shining, I don't get so much the sense off of it that the house is haunted by spirits so much as the hotel itself is an evil entity, that the hotel itself is alive, not necessarily haunted. And all the ghosts that live there are sort of like tentacles, like of the hotel. So I get the sense of the hotel as a living organism in the movie, as opposed to being haunted by something. And I think that's a more unique view. Now, mind you, the movie never actually says this. There's never outright stated. This is just my interpretation, or how I see the film every time I watch it. I can't help but get the feeling that the hotel itself is alive and watching over the characters and doing everything in its power to try to drive them over the edge.
So the Halloran character in the book, he does not die. He you see him, he goes through hell or high water to get to the hotel, and because he wants to save Danny and Wendy, and that's exactly what he does when he gets there. And I think it's so much more effective in the movie for you to see him go through his whole struggle of getting to that hotel to save them, and it's such a shocking moment when he takes a few steps into the hotel and bam, axe to the chest. I always thought that was one of the most shocking parts of the movie.
And I think it's the only scene that's a typical jump scare. And I think what makes that jump scare more shocking is it's a jump scare that doesn't even exist in the book. So even if you've read the novel, that scene at the time probably would have caught you really off guard, and you realize, holy shit, I don't know what's going to happen. Even if I read the book, that's not going to tell me how this movie is going to end.
Yeah, exactly. The ending, of course, another typical ending where everything explodes.
And I think the ambiguous ending of this movie works really well because it's a movie where you're never sure what's going on. You're constantly disoriented and you have a hard time telling what's real and what's not. And then to end on that July 4th, 1921 photograph of that ball at the Overlook Hotel, and to see Jack Torrance there right in the middle of it all, and the way that the camera zooms in on it is so creepy. It doesn't answer anything, and all it does is raise more questions in the audience's mind. And it's because of that, it's a movie that feels like it lives on forever. It draws you back over and over. It's like a puzzle that you always think that you're on the verge of solving but could never quite get there. It's filled with intricacies and mystery that draw you in every single time, and every time you think that you could solve this movie or you get a finger on it, there's something that just feels slightly off balance, and that's a big part of what makes this movie immortal. It doesn't just, in a normal movie, when it ends and everything, there's closure, you could go about your life and not really think about it because you know how it ends, there's closure. But a movie that's this ambiguous draws you back over and over again to study its mysteries.
Yeah, and things keep happening throughout the movie that make you recall things that happened before that. You know what I mean? Like seeing that image of him at the end when he's at the ball, and you see his picture and they zoom out on it, and I automatically think when Grady told him, "You've always been the caretaker here."
Mm-hmm.
So then you start thinking, was his soul trapped there? The ambiguity of it is just fascinating to me.
And another thing about that ambiguity is it's led a lot of people to look into theories on The Shining that are very interesting. So in 2013, there was a documentary called Room 237 that took different fan theories and tried to put them together, and it's just about how people obsess over this movie. There's a theory that people have that the movie is actually about the Holocaust, that it's a coded metaphor for the Holocaust because of things that are hidden in the background. I personally think that's complete bullshit. I don't think that's even remotely even there. However, because the film is so ambiguous and it's kind of a Rorschach test, it invites people to have ridiculous interpretations like that. Another interpretation is that it's about Native American genocide. Now, I'm not sure if I buy that either, but I find that a little bit more believable because they do make several references to Native Americans and the fact that this was built on Indian burial ground. And that aspect is emphasized in the movie more than it is in the book. And there was a version of the script early on that was going to feature more overt Native American imagery and a Native American mask that kind of haunts Danny in it. So I think there's a little bit more validity to that. And then there's also the crazy theory that it was Stanley Kubrick's confession for having faked the moon landing, which I think is also complete bullshit. Because the idea was because 2001: A Space Odyssey was so realistic, it was made a year before we actually landed on the moon. People will tell you that that was Kubrick's training for NASA and the government to actually fake the moon landing. And in the movie, you see, like you said, they have room 237. When Danny is heading towards that room, he rises up. And if you notice, the shirt that he's wearing is a NASA shirt with a rocket that's aimed forward, and it kind of rises up. Now, I think that's really digging. I don't think that's what's actually there. But I guess I could see how so many people would have these wild interpretations because the movie doesn't answer any questions. It's the type of movie that if you want to figure out, you'll spend the entire time analyzing every little single frame and looking for clues to try to clue you in to the hidden messages, the subliminal messages that Stanley Kubrick was supposedly aiming for. And I think that's wrong. I think anything that's subliminal is designed for your imagination to play tricks on itself, which is why people have these ridiculous interpretations of the film.
And I remember watching that documentary, and when you first start watching it, they bring up a few coincidences, a few very interesting facts and stuff, and you're like, whoa, you kind of scratch your head a little bit. And then a few minutes into it, you're like, okay, that's a little far-fetched, and then they get ridiculous by the end.
But only a movie like The Shining could invite such ridiculous fan theories. I don't think a straightforward movie, like, you don't hear anybody analyzing The Omen like that. Or even Exorcist, which is a great horror film in a completely different way, but it's so straightforward that people don't go back to it to try to understand the mysteries or try to get to the bottom of something. People think they're detectives when they analyze and try to break down The Shining.
Yeah, because Kubrick shows you so much. He shows you so much throughout that movie, and you still feel that there's a lot that's not there, that you don't see, that's there that you don't see. There's it's just that mystery about it that lingers throughout the whole film all the way up to the end.
Every time you watch The Shining, no matter how many times you see it, it's like it's magic. It's pure movie magic. It feels like you become hypnotized by this environment, by this world that you get lost in. And then when you get released back into the real world, you're left with nothing but questions.
Yeah.
And it keeps drawing you back over and over again.
It's impactful in so many ways. It's not a one-trick pony. It's like a 50-trick pony.
So interestingly enough, when it came out, it wasn't well received by many critics, and a lot of audience members were really perplexed by it. And I think part of the reason is that Stanley Kubrick was doing something so original that it was hard for people to comprehend what he was after at the time, because no other horror film had ever been shot like this before. Horror films didn't use these types of techniques to try to get the point across, and few of them trafficked in this type of ambiguity. And I think also, like I said earlier, because it's dependent upon a mood of dread and unease and getting the audience unsettled, and less on jump scares and the typical thrills that you're looking for in movies. So here's some of the things that critics actually said about The Shining when it came out. Gary Arnold of the Washington Post said, Stanley Kubrick's production of The Shining, a ponderous, lackluster distillation of Stephen King's best-selling novel, looms as the big letdown of the new film season. I can't recall a more elaborately ineffective scare movie. Gene Siskel of the Chicago Tribune gave it 2 out of 4 stars and called it a crashing disappointment. The biggest surprise is that it contains virtually no thrills. Given Kubrick's world-class reputations, one's immediate reaction is that maybe he was after something other than thrills in the film. If so, it's hard to figure out what. And in a way, Gene Siskel's negative comments actually tap into why it makes it so great, because he's not after typical thrills. And I think it's a type of film that sometimes for some people requires multiple viewings before you start to fully grasp what Kubrick was after. Kevin Thomas of the LA Times wrote, there are moments so visually stunning only a Kubrick could pull them off. Yet the film is too grandiose to be the jolter that horror pictures are expected to be. There's the problem. The jolter that horror pictures are expected to be. Both those expecting significance from Kubrick and those merely looking for a good scare may be equally disappointed. And he is wrong. And it's interesting, these negative reviews are tapping into why it works so well, is that it's not what you expect of a horror movie. Pauline Kael of The New Yorker, who is one of the most outspoken Kubrick critics, said, again and again, the movie leads us to expect something, almost promises it, and then disappoints us. No, it's that lack of delivery, Pauline Kael, that makes people so hypnotized by it. Variety was very critical and said, with everything to work with, Kubrick has teamed with jumpy Jack Nicholson to destroy all that was so terrifying about Stephen King's bestseller. Despite the movie ended up being a commercial success despite the fact that it wasn't very well received by critics, and it was nominated for 2 Golden Raspberry Awards, for Worst Actress for Shelley Duvall, which is really insulting, and Worst Director for Stanley Kubrick, and it lost both awards. So when it came out, this was really shit on, nobody got it. But yet, like every Kubrick film, over the years, it started to garner a certain reputation, and there was a great critical reevaluation. Another one was Roger Ebert, who was not a fan of it and thought that the film really didn't connect. Rewatched it about 15 years later and came to the conclusion that it's a masterpiece, that he was looking for the wrong things when he first went to go see it, because our brains are so attuned to watching horror movies in a certain way, and Stanley Kubrick made a horror film that is antithetical to the way that we normally experience horror films. And I think it took the audience a while for it to catch up. In 2018, the film was selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress as being culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. So for all of its negative backlash and everything, it has grown into a classic. And a lot of the critics who gave it negative reviews at the time have come to reevaluate it and come to praise it again over the years. But I think that's a product of Kubrick. Most of his films were so ahead of his time that people didn't know what to make of it. The same thing happened with 2001: A Space Odyssey. People were baffled by it, thought it was completely pointless. Now it's considered one of the greatest films in existence. People misunderstood A Clockwork Orange at the time, and now years later I think people finally get what that movie was going after. Barry Lyndon, which at the time is one of Kubrick's biggest critical failure, commercial failures. As a movie, I think it's a masterpiece. But over the years, people have gone on to reevaluate Barry Lyndon, and it's now considered one of his best films by the film community. So Kubrick had this thing where he was always so far ahead of the audience that it always took people years to catch up to what he was after or what he was going for. And I think that's what makes his films immortal and why they last so long. Almost every other typical filmmaker, even in the best movies, the first time you watch them, all of its secrets and everything is revealed to you on the first viewing, and you go back again to kind of relive it and try to capture that again. Kubrick's movies seem different every time you watch them at any point in your life. You could watch them over and over, and they always mean something different to you, and they are made in such a way that draws the audience back over and over and over again. And that's why his movies are so classic. They're so immortal.
Well, it's always a goal for me as a reviewer to never be that clueless and never let a movie like that fly under my radar. Because it seems like to this day, a lot of reviewers and a lot of fans, they turn on anything that's truly original, anything that's doing something atypical, something different than any other movie they'd seen before. They seem to rebel against that. And they're still doing it to this day with movies like Midsommar and Hereditary and The Witch and The Lighthouse. It confounded
all of those films, by the way, all of those films owe a huge debt to The Shining.
Yeah, so something truly original is going to split fans right down the middle, especially with horror. And it seems like even to this day, The Shining itself still has a lot of detractors. Especially people who enjoy the book more than they do the movie.
Yeah, but even though it has a lot of detractors, I feel like its reputation has kind of outlived it and outclassed it. Like whatever you think of The Shining, and you may very well not like it as much as Mike and I do, and I get that not everybody loves this film as much as we do. There's a reason this movie has lasted so long, and people still quote it and reference it and parody it to this day. There's a reason that doesn't just happen by accident, that a movie just so happens to last 40 years and remains fresh with each generation.
Yeah, the quality is undeniable, and the impact it's had on the horror genre and films in general is undeniable.
Yes.
And just to show how undeniable the influence of this movie is, I made a list of the main references in pop culture throughout movies and TV that have referenced The Shining. It started right away. In 1981, Student Bodies, I believe that's the one with Brad Pitt, the killer, and there's the breather, and at one point he said, here's breather. And then in 82, in Poltergeist, Carol Ann wakes up at 2:37 to meet the ghosts. Also in 82, Friday the 13th has a smashed door with an axe, much like The Shining. And also in the same year, Pieces had another smashed door with an axe that was sent up to The Shining. And then, of course, in 94, you had The Simpsons and the Treehouse of Horror doing The Shinning, where groundskeeper Willie says, you got to say The Shinning. You want to get sued?
And that Shining parody on The Simpsons Treehouse of Horror is one of the most popular and beloved episodes of The Simpsons. I've seen it so many times, and that in unto itself became a pop culture reference, The Simpsons parody of The Shining.
Yeah, because you nerd out on it as a Shining fan, and then also it's hilarious on top of that. A very clever parody of it.
And really quick, Matt Groening, the creator of The Simpsons, is a huge Stanley Kubrick fan. And everybody who watches The Simpsons or used to watch it knows that it is loaded with references to culture, everything, whether it's politics, music, entertainment, art, history. The two most referenced artists on The Simpsons are Stanley Kubrick and Edgar Allan Poe. So they were both heavily influenced by Stanley Kubrick, and in turn, Stanley Kubrick was actually a big fan of The Simpsons. He lived in London when the show was airing. He was not living in the US anymore, but he used to have people tape it and send him tapes of The Simpsons to watch in the privacy of his own home. So the respect and the love between these artists was mutual.
Yeah. And then you have a couple of years after that, The Simpsons, the Shining, was Twister with Helen Hunt and Bill Paxton. The Shining was playing at a drive-in theater just before it gets demolished by a tornado. And then in 2008, the sitcom The Office, the character Dwight says all work and no play makes Michael a dull boy. And then there was 2 references in Family Guy in 2009, the animated series Family Guy. The first time Stewie runs over the Grady twins with his bicycle, and the second time he blows them up with a bazooka. And then, of course, in 2018, Ready Player One, we discussed that on the podcast about all the Shining references. Because in Ready Player One, the second key challenge in the Oasis is the Shining movie itself. So you end up seeing the Grady twins, the Elevator of Blood, the old lady in the bathroom, and Jack Torrance himself. And then there was 2 music videos. I'm sure there were many more, but 2 popular music videos kind of did a send-up of The Shining. Slipknot's Spit It Out. They had the Grady twins in it. There was an axe in it, Slipknot written like red rum, and there was even a snowy maze. And then in 30 Seconds to Mars video for The Kill, the band arrives at a hotel that looks just like the Overlook, and they feature the typewriter on there and the old lady in the bathroom and everything. So this The Shining has been peppered throughout pop culture ever since it came out, and it still keeps going.
One thing that you missed that I wanted to mention was the South Park episode from 2012 called A Nightmare on FaceTime. It involves the character Stan and his father, Randy. Randy announces to the family that he's purchasing a Blockbuster Video, which is already going out of business, of course, and he doesn't realize it. And the whole joke of the episode is that they are all stuck in this Blockbuster where Randy is insistent that this is going to take off and people are going to come and start renting movies, and he slowly starts to go insane the way that Jack Nicholson goes insane in The Shining. They imitate a lot of the shots of like Randy Jack, like the scene that you were referencing earlier where Jack Nicholson is staring off into the distance with that glowing light in his face and he's watching over his family. They repeat that scene in South Park, but it turns out that Randy is actually watching Ted, the Seth MacFarlane movie, as he's going insane, which is a swipe at Seth MacFarlane because Trey Stone and Matt Parker hate Seth MacFarlane. And when Randy starts chasing Stan around the building, the Blockbuster, he goes, "Stanny boy!" And he's carrying a big axe. It is one of the best and most under talked about Shining parodies I think I've ever seen.
Nice.
Yeah,
and I think this is one of the reasons why The Shining has more detractors than I realized it did. Because it's been so much a part of our lives. So these kids that are coming up that are just getting old enough to look at it and appreciate it now, they've seen it. They've seen images of it throughout their entire lives. So that I guess it's oversaturation, I guess, and they think it's they get tired of seeing it all the time. So they think if I'm seeing it this much throughout my whole life, all these references, it must be the greatest thing ever. So then when they watch it and it's not what they thought it was, they hate it. Yes. So it's between them and the people who don't like it because it doesn't stick closely to the book. Yep. But like I said, its influence and its quality is undeniable.
Really quick, one thing before, because I think we're coming to the end. One of the things that I wanted to discuss that I keep skipping over, to me, one of the best sequences in the history of the horror genre is the Room 237 sequence, where after Danny has been attacked by the crazy lady in Room 237, which we never actually see, Wendy goes and forces Jack to go check it out. And the way that it happens is the camera glides through into Room 237 almost as it's the evil presence following along with Jack. And there's something very surreal with the sound effects as you hear like a certain type of heartbeat and this eerie music as the camera tracks through. When he gets to the room, you see a beautiful woman naked coming out of the bathtub. And of course, Jack, being the perv that he is, comes and starts making out with her. And then he looks in the mirror and she sees that she's rotting. And the way that he gets horrified and backs away from her slowly, you see the lady walking towards the camera in a very surreal, slow way. Jack Nicholson is not backing away fast the way that you would in real life. He seems completely shell-shocked by what he's seeing, and it flashes in between shots of maybe that woman or possibly another woman rising up out of the bathtub after she apparently committed suicide. And then it flashes to scenes of Danny shaking his head uncontrollably and looking very disturbed. And it's these very off-kilter elements that all put together give me one of the most eeriest scenes I've ever seen in a horror movie. It's not a jump scare, it doesn't make you jump back, but it's mesmerizing in a way that you feel like you're experiencing a nightmare in real time. The way that it plays out is so unreal, and there's nothing like that in the history of horror. I've never seen a scene that is mesmerizing in that particular way, in a way that feels like you're trapped in a fucking nightmare that you can't escape. Everything about it is just absolutely perfect, technically marvelous, beautifully scored, excellently acted, just these stunning visuals that just keep you off kilter the entire time. And when I was rewatching it again last night, I was breaking down that scene and analyzing what makes it work so well and all the techniques that make it work so well. And even as I was breaking down the techniques and analyzing it and trying to tear it apart, it still creeped me out. It is so effective that you could break it apart in front of your eyes and study the techniques and still be extremely unsettled by the imagery that you're seeing. Nobody put images on screen like Stanley Kubrick. He had that photographer's eye where he knew just the right image that would trigger the subconscious mind to go off in all kinds of different directions.
Because it's so much nuance and so many layers running in tandem. So it's so many elements that grab you, that it's never just, there's never one scene where just one thing is effective about it. It's always a multiple amount of things, from the score to the acting to the writing, everything. Everything just comes in tandem, and it's just the perfect storm of excellent cinematic horror. Yeah,
it radiates evil, and I think that's what separates it from most horror movies. That it feels like it feels like the movie itself is radiating a certain vibe that you just don't really see too often. Even in the best horror movies, don't manage to make you feel like you're inside the environment of the film. Nothing really like it in the history of the genre.
And that includes some of the mundane moments just as much as the fantastical moments. Because you get these mundane moments of just the family hanging out together, or a guy just discussing something with his peers, and then it brings you into their psyche.
What makes it's extremely mundane for parts. It's extremely mundane, and it's almost dry for a lot of like the early sections. But even when it's mundane or dry, you get the sense of something creeping in around the edges. There's like a cold atmosphere to the movie that I can't describe. And I'm trying to put my finger on what it is. It's not just the way the movie's lit. It's the sound. It's the way that the dialogue is recorded. You could feel the cold and the emptiness in the hotel when they're speaking. You get like the way that it would sound to speak inside a large, empty environment. And it's something that they did with the dialogue mix that I can't put my finger on, that also helps to sell the environment of the movie.
And even in the mundane scenes, there's little hints and clues that keeps you in this sense of dread throughout, even when you're watching just a mundane, normal, everyday scene.
And another thing I wanted to mention, a lot of people will criticize Jack Nicholson's performance, even people who like the movie, as it being overly hammy and a little bit over the top. What I've noticed when I watch this again, I think that's because Jack Nicholson is not the protagonist of this movie, Jack Torrance. It's not even Wendy either. Danny is actually the protagonist of the movie. So he's kind of like the audience's entry point in the movie. When the camera isn't assuming the presence of evil, it takes on the perspective of Danny more than any other character, which is why I think his performance, his father comes off as so over the top and so hammy, because from the psychological viewpoint of a 6-year-old boy, your father, who you love and who you look up to and is supposed to protect you, would seem exaggeratedly monstrous if he were coming after you and he were trying to kill you and your entire family. And I think that's an idea that Mike Flanagan actually expanded upon in his sequel, Dr. Sleep, which was the adaptation of Stephen King's sequel to The Shining. I feel like he really zeroes in on that aspect, is that some of his performance is a little over the top because it's from the perspective of a child.
Yeah, and also the Danny character, he's the only character in the movie that knows what we know. Mm-hmm. But he knows because of his the Shining ability. Mm-hmm. So we're experiencing those things with him because we get that sense of dread. We get all the clues that something bad's about to happen, and he's getting those clues at the same time, but in a different way. So we're very much experiencing it through his eyes.
Yes. So, yeah, and that's just a big part of why it makes it so effective. Such a legendary film, so many components that make it what it is. I hope we did it justice.
Yeah, I tried. I mean, I researched the hell out of this thing, even though I've seen it multiple times, frontwards and backwards, and I've even watched it silent before, just sitting in a room at a party or something, just watching it on screen, and enjoyed it just as much. It's just something it's a never-ending sea of cinematic and horror greatness that you can just pick apart. You can be excited and frightened by it, no matter how many times you've seen it. And there's always something different to appreciate about it each time, because it's so nuanced and so layered and excellent. Still excellent to this day. I enjoyed it just as much last night as I ever did.
So did I. So for anybody out there who hasn't seen The Shining, what the fuck are you waiting for? Get off that shit now. Watch it. If you're a big fan of the modern day type of elevated horror that's become popular, that Ari Aster and Robert Eggers has sort of popularized, you need to go back and watch The Shining, because that, along with maybe The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby, I feel is the text, the blueprint for what people would describe as elevated horror nowadays. And yeah. I think that I've noticed is that a lot of the people who don't appreciate films like Hereditary or The Witch are the same type of people who wouldn't be fans of The Shining.
Yeah.
Not always.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, we hope you enjoyed that in-depth dive into The Shining. We try to have as much information as possible. And bear in mind, Mike and I each did our own research for this movie, found out some interesting stuff. But if you really want to learn a lot about the movie, there's so much more left to research. One quick thing before we go. The Here's Johnny scene where Jack Nicholson kind of breaks through the door and does that Here's Johnny line. That was a reference to Johnny Carson. Late night TV show host who was popular in the 80s and 90s, was superseded by Jay Leno was his successor. Kubrick was actually living in London at the time, and he wasn't even aware of that Johnny Carson line, "Who's Johnny?" And he actually almost cut it out of the movie because it was completely ad-libbed by Jack Nicholson. When he left it in, he was not even aware that was a thing in pop culture. So if you were aware, he might have taken out one of the most iconic scenes in the movie.
That's crazy. So as you can see, we absolutely love this movie. If this, hour and a half, 2 hour podcast wasn't testament enough. Yeah. So we hope to be doing this with more movies in the future.
Yes. Well, we'll be back next week with a good podcast for you. Until next week, folks, happy horror.
Horror.